What did William Whewell mean by the sensationalistic school?
Whewell meant to belittle the view of empiricists who held that all knowledge was the result of sensory experience, or what Whewell thought was mere sensation.
Who was Antonio Gramsci?
While Antonio Gramsci, 1891 to 1937, was in prison, he worked out his version of Marxism, which was mainly a revolt against Karl Marx's, 1818 to 1883, historical determinism. Gramsci's prison notebooks, compiled after his death, beginning in 1971, was edited for publication by Palmiro Togliatti, who succeeded him as leader of the Italian Communists. According to Togliatti, education and persuasion were the paths to reform toward a classless society. Rather than Bolshevism or direct political revolution. Gramsci's most influential idea has been what Togliatti called Gramsci's theory of hegemony, whereby the dominant class in society creates not only its own ideology, but also that of the classes dominated by it. All classes share the ideology of the dominant class. Hence, education and persuasion are important to change the social mass mind, so that political change can evolve. In this sense, it could be said that Gramsci was not only a member in spirit of the Frankfurt School, he was also a structuralist.
How were Ludwig Feuerbach's ideas received?
After his early publication of work critical of Christianity, Feuerbach was dismissed from a teaching position at Erlangen University, where he had gotten his doctorate in philosophy. After that, he could not secure further academic employment. His ensuing criticism of Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831, did not help his situation.
What are some other notable works by Montaigne?
In addition to his skeptical writings, Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, became famous for the whole of his essays. 1560, literally, attempts, the most substantial of which was his The Apology of Raymond Sebond. The essays here were far-ranging, witty, digressive, and all about him, his tastes, opinions, and large and petty problems. He also wrote about his trip to Germany, Switzerland, and Italy in his journal de Voyage en Italie par la Suisse et l'Allemagne en 1580 et 1581, Travel Journal. Undertaken after he had presented a copy of his essays to the French king. Montaigne was diplomatically active in trying to quell religious antagonism and instrumental in securing Henry of Navarre's ascension to the throne as King Henry IV. He probably would have become a member of Henry's court had illness not intervened.
Who was Rudolf Carnap?
Rudolf Carnap, 1891 to 1970, is famous for his work on scientific verification. He received his PhD from the University of Jena. He was a member of the Vienna Circle until he left Germany in 1935 to teach at the University of Chicago and the University of California at Los Angeles. In his early work he focused on the logical structure of language and what it implied about the world. In the 1940s, Carnap worked on logic and introduced the idea of a state description, which is the linguistic form of a possible world, or the most complete description of the world that can be given in any language. Unlike earlier logical positivists, Carnap addressed the problem of inconclusive evidence. For actual scientific verification and the meaning of scientific terms, he argued for the use of probability in determining degrees of confirmation in place of absolute verification. Carnap's principal works include The Logical Structure of the World, 1928, English translation, 1967. Philosophy and Logical Syntax, 1935, Introduction to Semantics, 1942, Formalization of Logic, 1943. Meaning and Necessity, A Study in Semantics and Modal Logic, 1947, and Logical Foundations of Probability, 1950.
What was Berkeley's answer to whether a tree falling in the forest makes a sound?
Berkeley said that objects we sense only exist insofar as we have ideas of their sensory qualities. When we do not perceive those qualities, such as the sound of a tree falling in a forest, then they do not exist as our ideas. However, this would not entitle us to conclude that such a tree makes no sound. Our ideas of sensory qualities come to us from God, who has created them. If a tree falls in the forest and God creates the sound of its crashing down, then that idea in God's mind would guarantee the occurrence of the sound, even though human beings could not perceive it. The same reasoning was applied by Berkeley to the continued existence of a room when no people are inside it. It would still exist as a series of ideas in God's mind.
What is philosophy of technology?
Ideas of technology go back to Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE, and Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, who spoke of techne, or knowledge of art and craft, which included arithmetic and medicine. Such knowledge understands itself, according to universals and causes. It can be taught and is distinct from physis, or nature. Contemporary philosophy of technology is a multidisciplinary field dedicated to studying the cultural effects and causes of technology, both historically and in its emergent forms. The American Philosophical Association publishes a newsletter on philosophy and computers, and there are academic journals such as Ends and Means. Net Future Technology and Human Responsibility, and Techni, Research in Philosophy and Technology.
How did William James express his own will to believe?
In the 1880s, James wanted to apply scientific methodology to mind reading and spiritualism. He could not find collaborators in the Harvard academic community. But in England at that time both Alfred Russel Wallace, who had discovered the theory of evolution at the same time as Charles Darwin, and the moral philosopher Henry Sidgwick, 1838 to 1900, and his wife, Nora, were already interested in subjects of this sort. James became part of a group of intellectuals who went to seances and carefully investigated reports of supernatural events. They also counted reports of apparitions that occurred on the same day the person whose apparition appeared, had died. This so-called census of hallucinations resulted in a statistically significant correlation between day of death and appearance of that person's ghost. However, James thought that the sample of 17,000 would have yielded more reliable results if it were 50,000 and included American as well as British apparitions. James was also very skeptical of the table rapping and spirit-directed writing that were routine at seances. And he wanted to exclude mediums from the ranks of reputable spiritual researchers.
What were Hippocrates' accomplishments and influence?
In founding his own school, Hippocrates, 465 to 370 BCE, formally established medicine as distinct from theurgy, natural magic, and philosophy. He himself had learned medicine from his father and grandfather. According to the Hippocratic school, illness was caused by an imbalance of four humors that were supposed to be equal in the body: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Every disease progressed to a crisis, from which either death or natural recovery would ensue. Hippocratic medical practice was passive because it was believed that the body would heal itself given rest and immobilization. The therapy was always gentle, and usually only clean water, wine, or balms were used. Being able to predict the course of an illness was considered important. In his On the Physician, Hippocrates stressed good grooming and a sober demeanor for doctors. It was important to keep records, not only about the patient but also about the patient's family and circumstances. Mystical causes of illness were dismissed. After Hippocrates' death, there was little advancement in the principles attributed to him. And some of his professional rules, such as taking case histories and keeping records, fell into disuse.
How was Giambattista Vico a unique philosopher of his time?
Giambattista Vico, or Giovanni Battista Vico, 1668–1744, was an Italian philosopher and jurist who is credited with having founded the philosophy of history, as well as the modern understanding of history. He provided painstaking analyses of ideas in the past and accounts of how they developed over time, due both to varied circumstances and events, as well as the content of the ideas themselves. In that sense, Vico invented intellectual history.
What did John Locke mean by saying the mind was a tabula rasa?
Unlike the rationalists, who thought that we were born with certain ideas about the world, Locke thought that our minds are like a blank slate, tabula rasa, at birth. All of our ideas are the result of two different processes that happen after we are born. The first is sensory experience, and the second is our reflection on our sensory experience and on the workings of our own minds. One of his main arguments against innate ideas was that people do not all have the same ideas, but their ideas differ as their experience has differed.
Who were René Descartes' royal female correspondents?
Descartes corresponded with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was very interested in applying his doctrines for clear thought. As a result of this exchange, he wrote The Passions of the Soul, 1669, which was an account of how the mind worked and was connected to the body. In the same year, Descartes agreed to move to Stockholm to tutor Queen Christina. Like Princess Elizabeth, she was drawn to Descartes' ideas and wished to be well informed and educated, in general. A small pension from the King of France had been delayed for many years, and Descartes needed the funds, as well as the honor of royal patronage. He called Sweden the land of the bears and was much inconvenienced by demands of the athletic young queen that he begin his lessons for her at 5 a.m. Descartes had always been a late riser, preferring to begin his day by reflecting in bed until noon. When he was a student at La Flèche, he had been given special permission not to rise early. Descartes biographers believe that the change in his routine weakened him. He caught pneumonia and soon died.
What was medieval philosophy?
Medieval philosophy was the historical period of thought from the 4th through the 14th centuries, which was dominated by religious concerns, the study of ancient Greek philosophy, and a need to reconcile rational inquiry with religious faith. It was mainly, but not completely, limited to the implications of Christian doctrine. Thus, Saint Augustine, 354–430, in the 4th century gave Christianity its first philosophical foundation in politics and ethics. and at the end of the era Nicholas of Orsma, 1323–1382. In working out Aristotelian theories of motion that were approved by the Church, he was able to anticipate infinitesimal calculus and coordinate geometry, before Galileo's mechanical theories.
Has science removed all of the mystery of life?
Not exactly. The radical materialist idea that organisms are computations of their genes and environmental conditions has had critics. Most notably Richard Lewontin, 1929, in his Biology as Ideology. The Doctrine of DNA, 1991, and the Triple Helix, Gene, Organism, and Environment, 2000. Lewontin's main contribution has been to point out that seemingly random factors in the development of organisms, which cannot be predicted before the fact, are the third element in biological replication.
What other continental traditions are new to Western philosophy?
Recent decades have seen renewed interest in African, Japanese, Chinese, and Indian philosophies among Euro-American philosophers. Some of this work has been called comparative philosophy because it seeks to relate themes that are well established and well developed philosophies in their continents of origin to traditional interests in Western philosophy. Japanese, Chinese, and Indian philosophies admit to the comparative treatment because they have long, well-established textual traditions. However, African philosophy is a less clear case. Not because it fails to treat issues that in the Western tradition would without doubt be considered philosophical, but because much of it has endured through oral traditions. Still, a broad recognition of African culture and its historical civilizations, after the 1960s, led to the Euro-American perspective of Afrocentrism among some members of the African diaspora.
Who was Simone de Beauvoir?
Simone de Beauvoir, 1908–1986, is now most famous as the philosopher who began the second wave of feminism in the West. She began writing when she was 8 years old and was a novelist and political writer who helped Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905–1980, her main lifelong companion, found Le Monde. De Beauvoir's major works include the novels She Came to Stay, 1943, The Blood of Others, 1945, and The Mandarins, 1954, and her philosophical texts The Ethics of Ambiguity, 1947, The Second Sex, 1949, and Old Age, 1970. She also wrote evocative autobiographical works, such as Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, 1958. De Beauvoir ruthlessly described Sartre's great decline toward the end of his life in Adieu, A Farewell to Sartre, 1981. Beauvoir also quarreled fiercely with Arlette Elcom, the young Jewish Algerian student who had contacted Sartre when she was 18. Sartre enjoyed discussing his philosophy with Elcom, and he preferred to write in her apartment, instead of following his lifetime habit of writing in cafes. Then he adopted her and bought her a house in the south of France, which became their summer vacation home. Beauvoir had an adopted daughter of her own, Sylvie Le Bon de Beauvoir, with whom she had had an erotic relationship, although Sylvie later described it as platonic. Sylvie wrote Tête-à-Tête, 2005, about de Beauvoir and Sartre. In 2005, Sylvie and Sartre's daughter were not on speaking terms. Each in her 60s. They continued to bitterly contest their respective rights to Sartre and de Beauvoir's literary properties. Since Sartre and de Beauvoir are inextricably linked through letters in which they discussed each other, the complexity of the dispute between their literary heiresses can only be imagined. By 2005, Sylvie was a retired philosophy teacher and Arlette was described as extremely reclusive. Geographically, these women had lived close to each other in the same Parisian arrondissement, for some years. Beauvoir had a high tolerance for alcohol all her life. She liked its taste, but drank more heavily in her later years. She was also hooked on amphetamines. When she died in 1986, she was buried in Sartre's grave, thereby sealing their link for posterity.
What was Ralph Barton Perry's realism?
Perry wrote The New Realism, Cooperative Studies in Philosophy, 1912, with 5 others, Edwin B. Holt, Walter T. Marvin, William Pepperell Montague, Walter Boughton Pitkin, and Edward Gleason Spalding. They were in revolt against both idealism and dualism, holding that what we perceive and remember are what they appear to be, as we are conscious of them. Their conclusions were similar to those of G. E. Moore's, 1873 to 1958, Common Sense Attack on Idealism.
Why did John Stuart Mill distrust majority rule?
Mill argued in On Liberty, 1859, that the whole of society could be swayed by the mere opinions and passions of a majority. For this reason, free speech was essential. Even if those who seek to suppress free speech are correct, if they are not willing to present their arguments afresh, they might come to hold their correct conclusions as mere superstitions. Mill thus believed in freedom of opinion for its utility in promoting a generally rational pubic epistemology or shared theory of what constitutes knowledge. He thought it was important that people have standards based on what is known as opposed to mere opinion. If there is free speech and public disagreement, then the parties that prevail have to give reasons for their views, according to Mill. In other words, Mill thought that free speech would encourage good arguments, and that good arguments would result in an informed public. Knowledge, according to Mill, required both reasoning and a justification of beliefs.
Is philosophy just the beliefs and theories of individual philosophers?
No, philosophy is a broad and messy subject. It can be divided into individual philosophers, subjects that two or more philosophers have emphasized, historical periods of time, and even places such as Greece, France, Germany, England, China, Africa, India, Latin America, and the United States. The chapters in this book take a chronological approach, identifying major themes within important time periods.
How did Alan Sokal attack postmodernism?
New York University physicist Alan Sokal wrote a spoof of postmodern scholarship titled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which was published by the postmodern journal Social Texts in its 1996 Spring/Summer Science Wars issue. When his article came out, Sokal simultaneously confessed his hoax in the academic gossip journal Lingua Franca. He referred to his Social Text article as a pastiche of left-wing cant, fawning references, grandiose quotations, and outright nonsense, which was structured around the silliest quotations I could find about mathematics and physics that recent postmodernist academics had written.
What did Plato mean by the divided line?
What Plato meant by the divided line is explained by Socrates in the Republic. Now take a line which has been cut into two unequal parts and divide each of them again in the same proportion. And suppose the two main divisions to answer, one to the visible and the other to the intelligible. And then compare the subdivisions in respect of their clearness and want of clearness. And you will find that the first section in the sphere of the visible consists of images.
What roles did others play in furthering Francis Bacon's ideas?
Samuel Hartlib, c. 1600 to 1662, a wealthy merchant with an interest in science, wrote description of the famous kingdom of Macaria. About a center of practical learning, inspired by Bacon's New Atlantis. Hartlib's friend, William Petty, 1623 to 1687, the founder of modern economics, envisioned a center for teaching practical trades, which he first proposed to Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691. A more theoretical precedent for these plans already existed in Gresham College, which was founded by Elizabeth I's financial agent in 1598. Professors there lectured on law, physics, rhetoric, divinity, music, geometry, and astronomy to scholars, nobles, and business and professional men.
What was Richard Rorty's view of truth?
Rorty, 1931 to 2007, criticized the idea that all we know are ideas that represent the world. Or representationalism. He also challenged the special intellectual role of philosophers. He thought that true is just an honorific term used within linguistic and knowledge communities to mean justified to the hilt. Rorty called this epistemological position liberal ironism because it rested on ideals of human freedom. He thought that commitment alone is adequate justification for belief. This view led Rorty into relativism.
Who were the main social Darwinists?
William Graham Sumner, 1840 to 1910, professor at Yale, was the American version of the English evolutionist Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903. Sumner was a strong advocate of unrestricted capitalism. He was famous for his essay The Man of Virtue, which promoted self-interest as a primary duty for individuals. The industrialist Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919, built on these ideas in his The Gospel of Wealth, which further enshrined the law of competition as a natural principle of progress.
Who was Johannes Scotus Eriugena?
Johannes Scotus Eriugena, c. 810 to 877, also known as John Scotus Eriugena, was a Christian rationalist. Literally, his name means John the Irishman, the Irishman. King John the Bold called him to his Palatine school to translate the Pseudo-Dionysius. This document was falsely attributed to Saint Dionysius, d. 268, a convert of Saint Paul, although it was in fact written by an unknown Neoplatonist. Eriogena's translation was initially a success. Building on its main ideas, he constructed his own system, De Divus Ioni Naturae. His basic premise was that logical reasoning ought to be compatible with Christian philosophy. This meant that the teachings of the Church Fathers could be criticized, if necessary. More heretically than that, it left no room for faith in divine creation and salvation. Eriugena's treatise was condemned by Pope Honorius III, 1148 to 1227, in 1225.
What did Søren Kierkegaard deem his main vocation in life?
Kierkegaard felt his main vocation was to reintroduce Christianity into Christendom. For him, Christianity was a way of existing. He thought that only humans existed, because they have internal reality. In contrast to God, who has external reality. Faith for him was an inward leap in answer to one burning question about God.
Who was Hilary Putnam?
Hilary Putnam's, 1926, extraordinarily productive career has encompassed metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language. He began to flourish in the philosophical generation after W. V. Quine, 1908 to 2000. Becoming a professor at Harvard in 1965. He collaborated with Quine on the ontology of mathematical entities and agreed with him about the analytic-synthetic distinction. In collaboration with his wife, Ruth Anna Jacobs, he helped revive late 20th century interest in the work of John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Putnam has also revived interest in William James, 1842 to 1910, work. Putnam's major publications include Mathematics, Matter, and Method, Philosophical Papers. Volume 1. 1975, 2nd ed. 1985, Mind, Language, and Reality, Philosophical Papers, Volume 2, 1975, Meaning and the Moral Sciences, 1978, Reason, Truth, and History, 1981, Realism and Reason, Philosophical Papers, Volume 3, 1983, The Many Faces of Realism, 1987, Representation and Reality. 1988, Renewing Philosophy, 1992, and Pragmatism, An Open Question, 1995. How did Hilary Putnam agree with W.V.O.?
Who was Frederick Douglass?
Many contemporary scholars of race consider Frederick Douglass, born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, 1818 to 1895, to be the first liberatory African American intellectual. In 1873, he was the vice presidential candidate when Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for U.S. president. Douglass began life as a slave, but was taught to read at the age of 12 by his owner's sister-in-law. He taught other slaves to read, and after a series of failed escapes he finally gained his freedom and became active in the Massachusetts anti-slavery movement. At 23 he began his distinguished and inspiring career of public speaking. He was present at the Seneca Falls Convention, where the American suffragist movement originated in 1848. Douglass toured Ireland and England in the mid-1840s, and his supporters raised money to legally purchase his freedom in 1856. Back in the United States, Douglass published newspapers, the most famous of which was the North Star. which had as the motto right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. In the 1850s, Douglas spoke for school desegregation in New York. During the U.S. Civil War, he promoted the rights of blacks to fight for the Union. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1862, he said, "We were waiting and listening as for a bolt from the sky, we were watching, by the dim light of the stars for the dawn of a new day, we were longing for the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries." In 1884, after his first wife had died, Douglas married Helen Pitts, a white suffragist from New York. Pitts had worked on Alpha, the 19th-century radical women's publication. While living in Washington, D.C., Douglas' main writings are a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. An American Slave, 1845, The Heroic Slave, Autographs for Freedom, 1853. My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, revised, 1892. He edited the North Star from 1847 to 1851, after which it became the Frederick Douglass paper.
What is Catherine MacKinnon's argument against pornography?
According to MacKinnon, pornography not only exploits and objectifies those women who are its subjects, but it also expresses and supports the overall oppression of women in society. The subordinate status of women in pornography, as well as the violence against women depicted in so many of its forms, is part of an unjust sex-gender system.
Was there other philosophical activity in St. Louis besides the St. Louis Hegelians?
Contemporary with the St. Louis Philosophical Society, and also located in St. Louis, were a Kant Club, an Aristotle Club, and a Plato Club that later became known as Academe.
What did Friedrich Nietzsche mean by power?
In his Will to Power, compiled posthumously in 1901. Nietzsche is more concerned with the power and strength of the individual than in the individual's control over others. Nietzsche believed that the world was in constant flux and that the only way living things could enjoy being alive was not by knowledge of ideal or unchanging entities, but by constantly increasing their own power. The will to live was for him identical to the will to power because existence is a continual struggle. The transmogrification of values by the overman would represent a future stage of this will to power in the form of new, successful life.
What is a syllogism?
According to Aristotle, a classic syllogism has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. If the major and minor premises are true, then it is not possible for the conclusion to be false, the conclusion must be true. For example, all men are mortal is a major premise. Socrates is a man is a minor premise. And Socrates is mortal is the conclusion.
What are some important facts about Martin Heidegger's life?
Heidegger was born in 1889 in the Black Forest in Meßkirch, Germany, an area to which he maintained close ties throughout his life. He attended gymnasium, high school, in Freiburg, beginning in 1906, where he read Franz Brentano's 1837 to 1917, on the manifold meaning of being according to Aristotle, 1862. He intended to become a Jesuit priest, but he was rejected. So he prepared for the Catholic priesthood at Ludwig University in Freiburg. He read the works of Edmund Husserl, 1859 to 1938, there and at the urging of his teachers, changed from theology to philosophy and mathematics. After marrying Elfriede Petri in March 1917, he joined the German army. Advancing rapidly to corporal, although he was discharged for reasons of health. As Husserl's assistant and a colleague of Karl Jaspers, 1883 to 1969, Heidegger was successful in philosophy, becoming an associate professor at the University of Marburg, where he wrote Being and Time. 1927, in a matter of months to secure that post. After this work, he experienced the well-known care, or turn in thought, which led to his An Introduction to Metaphysics, 1953. Among his students were future philosopher Herbert Marcuse, 1898 to 1979, and political theorist and philosopher Hannah Arendt, 1906 to 1975, who became his lover before she had to leave Germany. As a Jewish intellectual, it became evident that she was in danger. After being questioned by the Gestapo, the German secret police. During this time, Heidegger was influenced by Lao Tzu's work on meditation, which led to his own understanding of being through language. Heidegger became rector of the University of Freiburg in 1933 and was a member of the National Socialist Party. In 1945, the French military government removed his professorship. Although he was able to gain emeritus status, provided he did not teach again. He had a nervous breakdown in 1946 but wrote his letter on humanism to make it clear that, regarding his study of being, his work was not as humanistic as Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905 to 1980, and other existentialists had mistakenly assumed. In 1950 his professorship was restored, and in 1951 he was allowed to be professor emeritus. To recap, he was first given emeritus or retired status without having been reinstated as a professor. Then he was reinstated as a professor and was given a normal emeritus status after that. He continued his work until he died in 1976.
How did Edmund Husserl distinguish between two types of the self?
First, Husserl explained that there is the psychological ego, or the self that owns or makes the intentional acts of consciousness. The psychological ego exists in the world, because one can be aware of it as a self. But there is also the transcendental ego, for which there is a world and which is concerned about truth. The transcendental ego intends the world. The transcendental ego makes it possible for the psychological ego to exist, and it determines how it will function.
Who was Gotthold Lessing?
Gotthold Lessing, 1729–1781, represented the Philosophs in Germany, which was a difficult task, owing to the conservatism and strict censorship there. In Nathan the Wise, 1779, he argued for the toleration of Jews and for human equality across religions. In On the Education of the Human Race, 1780, he claimed that all religions are part of a progression of humanity to the point when it will turn away from religion and toward pure reason.
What was the Athenian school of Neoplatonism?
The Athenian school was founded by Plutarch of Athens, 350–433, and carried on by Syrianus, c. 370–437, whose most important student was Proclus, 412–485. This school was actually the same institution that had been Plato's academy. The Athenians added new levels to Iamblichus's system in the form of gods who were interested in philosophical matters and whose thought could be understood by mortals. Although they did not accept Iamblichus's notion of two ones.
Why were all of Charles Peirce's works published posthumously?
Peirce neither published nor prepared for publication the greater part of his work. When he died, his widow, Juliet, sold his papers to the Harvard University Philosophy Department for $6,000. Josiah Royce, 1855–1916, was supposed to supervise their organization, but he died 2 years later. Many of the papers were subsequently lost, misplaced, allowed to become disorganized, or simply taken. The late mathematics historian Caroline Isola, while conducting some research, chanced upon a trunk of Peirce's writings in the mid-1950s in a corner of the basement of Widener Library. The first edition of Peirce's collected papers was put together by Charles Hartshorne, Paul Weiss, and Arthur Burks during the 1930s. Critics have deemed this collection arbitrary and not truly representative of Peirce's thought, because it makes Peirce seem unnecessarily obscure and does not clarify the progression of his ideas. A chronological edition, 1989, of Peirce's work, edited by the Peirce Edition Project. Of the Indiana University at Indianapolis, has produced more coherent results. Covering the period from 1857 to 1886. Two other well-regarded efforts are Peirce's Cambridge Conferences. Lectures of 1898, 1992, and Peirce's Harvard Lectures on Pragmatism of 1903, 1997.
What was individually noteworthy about Diderot, D'Alembert, Holbach, and Montesquieu?
Denis Diderot, 1713 to 1784, was the general editor of the encyclopedia. His The Skeptic's Walk, 1747, was a robust attack on Christianity. His claim that the universe was wholly material and evolving, as asserted in Letter on the Blind, 1749, resulted in a brief imprisonment. Diderot's comedies were considered second-rate, but his literary analyses created the new genre of literary criticism. Jean-Léron d'Alembert, 1717-1783, was the chief philosopher in the Encyclopedists project. In his Discours préliminaire he divided a philosophy of man into pneumatology, or the human soul, logic, and ethics. He held that the substance of the universe cannot be known, and an essay on the elements of philosophy. 1759, defined the field as a comparison of phenomena, that is, appearances. Baron Paul Henry Dietrich de Holbach, 1723 to 1789, was a major contributor to the encyclopedia. He was a solicitor at the Paris Parliament and hosted philosophical dinners. He systematized Diderot's naturalism and published anonymous, irreligious treatises applying philosophy against the Catholic Church. He argued that everything in existence was based on matter and motion in a completely determined universe. Holbach thought that Christian virtues were unnatural, that piety was fanaticism, and that church officials were immoral. He was also a utilitarian. Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu, Charles Louis de Secondat, 1689 to 1755, was the chief political encyclopedist. His most famous work is The Spirit of the Laws, 1740 to 1748, in which he argued that governments can be divided into republics, monarchies, or despotisms, which are respectively motivated by political virtue, honor, and fear. Types of government depend on the character, history, and geography of a people. A constitutional government with a separation of executive, legislative, and judicial powers is the only form that can protect liberty. This idea influenced the framers of the U.S. Constitution.
What were W. V.O. Quine's most influential ideas?
Quine did not think that the analytic-synthetic distinction could be defended. Because he did not think that analytic could be defined in a non-circular way. He had a holistic view of knowledge, likening the whole of all of our theories to a web. He believed that assertions of existence were relative to specific theories. And he thought that philosophical epistemology should be naturalized. By this he meant that philosophical epistemology should be consistent with standards for scientific truth.
Who was Imre Lakatos?
Imre Lakatos, 1922 to 1974, main contribution to the philosophy of science was to reconcile the work of Karl Popper, 1902 to 1994, and Thomas Kuhn, 1922 to 1996. He was born Imre Avram Lipschitz to a Jewish family in Debrecen, Hungary. His mother and grandmother were killed at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Lakatos, which would be written Lakatos Imre in Hungarian, studied mathematics, physics, and philosophy at the University of Debrecen, changing his name to Imre Molnar to save himself from the Nazis. He was a communist during World War II and took the name Lakatos as a tribute to the Hungarian general and Prime Minister Géza Lakatos. He studied at Moscow State University, but then was imprisoned for revisionism. From 1950 to 1953 for ideas that reinterpreted Marxist doctrine in a way that Marxist authorities considered to be undermining to their official views. He then fled Hungary after the 1956 Soviet invasion. Lakatos earned his doctorate at Cambridge University in 1961 and lectured at the London School of Economics. Lakatos' major works include Proofs and Refutations, 1976, which is based on his doctoral dissertation. The Methodology of Scientific Research Programs. Philosophical Papers Volume 1, and Mathematics, Science and Epistemology, Philosophical Papers Volume 2, 1978.
What does Afrocentrism have to do with philosophy?
African philosophy is of interest to philosophers as a theoretical system of thought. Also, some philosophers have accepted the challenge raised by Afrocentrism, that Western philosophy has excluded the intellectual perspectives of Africans.
What general philosophical problems does environmentalism pose?
In more traditional philosophical terms, There are ontological and metaphysical issues involved in what counts as a unit in environmentalism. It is important to define the unit because that defines the subject matter theoretically, and makes it possible to keep track of what should be preserved, in practical terms.
How did William James come to develop pragmatism?
During the 1870s, James participated in a discussion group that became known as the Metaphysical Club. Its members included Charles Sanders Peirce, 1839–1914, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1841–1935, and mathematician and philosopher Chauncey Wright, 1830–1875. While the group was meeting, there was some concern on the part of civic leaders in New England that religion, particularly Protestantism, was suffering as a result of the popularity of Darwinism and intense interest in the sciences. At the time James began to teach philosophy, Harvard administrators had an interest in the potential of philosophy to support religion. When James began his career, the disciplinary boundaries between psychology and philosophy were fluid. Largely as the result of his work, the two fields were distinct by the end of his career. To this day, William James Hall houses the Harvard Department of Psychology.
What have been the main themes in philosophical feminism?
Philosophical feminists have thus far been very open to theoretical work from other disciplines. They have concentrated on theorizing the oppression of women in the history of philosophy, as well as contemporary culture. The result in the United States alone has been a vast body of work with many facets. Although feminism is hardly part of mainstream philosophy in academia, most philosophy departments now have women members. Examples of influential feminist scholarship include feminist reclamation, feminist epistemology, feminist political theory, and gender theory. An excellent overview of these subjects is Alison M. Jagger and Marian Young's A Companion to Feminist Philosophy, 2000.
How did other philosophers and scientists react to Pierre Gassendi's views?
Jean de Sillon, 1600–1667, and René Descartes, 1596–1650. Tried to develop positive knowledge claims that would avoid Gassendi's skepticism. Sillon argued that knowledge was possible because it existed in logic and the sciences. Descartes based his entire philosophy on an attempt to demonstrate the existence of certain scientific knowledge that would not conflict with church doctrine. In the end, the Jesuits upheld Gassendi's view that certainty is impossible and condemned Descartes.
What is the linguistic turn?
During the last half of the 20th century, at different times in different humanistic disciplines, scholars turned from talking about people and events in the world to talking about language, symbols, and how people and events were represented in popular culture, as well as academic disciplines. Language became the new main subject across disciplines.
Who were the St. Louis Hegelians?
They were a group of philosophers and teachers who founded the St. Louis Philosophical Society in 1866 and began to publish the Journal of Speculative Philosophy in 1867. The founding members were Henry C. Brockmeyer, 1826–1906, William T. Harris, 1835–1909, and Denton Jacques Snyder, 1841–1925. Brockmeyer was a Prussian immigrant who had come to the United States in 1844, attended Brown University, plied several trades, and lived in a hut, like Henry David Thoreau 1817–1862. Harris was a Yale dropout who came to St. Louis to teach Pitman shorthand. Brockmeyer and Harris undertook the project of translating Hegel's Science of Logic, 1812, into English. Snyder, who had graduated from Oberlin College, came to St. Louis in 1865 to teach at Christian Brothers College. How did the St.
What are the main themes and influences in philosophy of technology?
Most of the writing is on the progressive/environmentalist/feminist/postmodern side of contemporary philosophy. While not anti-technology per se, there is a deep suspicion of technology as a force in its own right that stems from Martin Heidegger's, 1889–1976, The Question Concerning Technology. By contrast, more optimistic views of technology stem from the writings of John Dewey, 1859–1952. Key issues are, whether technology can be controlled independently of radical economic and political changes, whether technology can correct its own excesses, and the roles played by technology in the history of science. Contemporary books of interest include, Michael Adass, Machines as the Measure of Men. Science, Technology, and Ideologies of Western Dominance, 1990, Eric Higgs Anthology Technology and the Good Life. 2000, and Hans Achterhues, American Philosophy of Technology, 2001.
Was Luce Irigary's speculum of the other woman socially relevant?
Yes, and it has also had a tremendous influence on students and scholars of French feminist philosophy. In the context of the women's health movement in the United States during the 1970s, it expressed part of the spirit of the gynecological aspect of women's liberation. Women began to rebel about the fact that there were so few women doctors and that male doctors treated their reproductive and childbirth issues in repressive ways. Women began to talk more openly about their feelings of shame about their own bodies. Members of some women's collectives began giving themselves and their friends gynecological examinations. And others, without prior medical training, taught themselves how to administer abortions. At the same time, the practices of natural childbirth, childbirth without medication, and nursing, which until then had been the only resort for many poor women, were advocated for privileged women, for the health of both mothers and babies. These examples of women taking responsibility for their health were motivated both by an ideology of rebellion against patriarchy and the goal of improving women's health. Since the 1970s, feminist advocates have pointed out that clinical medicine has traditionally been based on the male body. Some diseases have different symptoms in men and women, for example, heart disease. At this time, female doctors are commonplace, particularly in the practice of gynecology. And there is greater attention, overall, to women's health problems. Historical information on the 1970s women's health movement can be found at CWLU Her Story Project. The online history of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union is at http://www.cwluherstory.com.
What is anarchism?
Anarchism is the political doctrine that human happiness and well-being are best served without powerful political structures. Anarchists seek the decentralization of power, into small units, controlled by the people.
What was Jean-François Lyotard's view of postmodernism?
Lyotard defined postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives, or a skepticism that is not satisfied by legitimate orthodoxy. An example of the sort of narrative Lyotard had in mind was the Enlightenment account of the triumph of rationality and the liberation of the rational subject. Lyotard proposed that little narratives about unique events be constructed instead. In his The Differend, 1983, Lyotard considers disagreement between or among participants who cannot agree on the rules. As a result, the dispute cannot be resolved. So the best result that can occur is for all sides to be recognized.
What did St. Anselm of Canterbury begin?
St. Anselm, 1033–1109, known as Anselm of Canterbury, was a Benedictine monk and the second Norman Archbishop of Canterbury. He is famous for his ontological proof for the existence of God in proslogion, and for his model of satisfaction in the atonement in his Cur Deus Homo. Anselm's ontological argument to prove God's existence amounts to this. Imagine a being that is the greatest being that can be imagined. Such a being exists in the intellect alone. If this greatest being were to exist only in the intellect, a greater one that existed in reality could be imagined. But there cannot exist in reality a greater being than the greatest being that can be imagined. Therefore, that imagined being is the greatest being. Now, this greatest being would be everything and have every attribute that it is better to have than not to have. Living, wise, powerful, true, just, blessed. Unchangeable, non-physical, eternal, beautiful, harmonious, sweet, and so forth. That is, and this is the crux of the ontological argument, because being is better than non-being. God will have being, which is to say, he will exist. Anselm goes on to claim that God, as the greatest being that can be imagined, is simple. Everything that exists is better insofar as it more resembles the Creator of all things, namely, God. All created beings, which are created by God, owe their being and well-being to God. But God is independent and has no obligations to his creations.
What are some facts about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's life and career?
Merleau-Ponty's father was killed in World War I. He completed his philosophical studies at the École Normale Supérieure in 1930 and then taught in high schools throughout France. He wrote 2 dissertations for his doctorate and was given the chair of child psychology at the Sorbonne in 1949. Next, he was made chair of philosophy at the Collège de France in 1952. With Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905 to 1980, he founded the journal Les Temps Modernes. But he resigned from the publication as editor, partly in objection to Sartre's subject-object dichotomy. Merleau-Ponty wrote about their dispute in Adventures of the Dialectic, 1955. Overall, Merleau-Ponty opposed dualisms and he also criticized self versus world ideas. He thought that the self was as much a body as a mind and that our bodies are always in the world.